In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Well, hello, Sublation Media viewers and listeners and readers and Patreon supporters and non-Patreon supporters and Marxists and anti-Marxists and everyone in between. It's me again, Douglas Lain.
And I'm Ashley Frawley, getting distracted by the chat again. I was checking if anybody was in there.
There's one person in the chat. So hello, Andrew and Kusluk. We had a holiday last week, and then it turned out that yesterday was Boxing Day, and we had planned to come back yesterday, but then at the last minute, both of us discovered that Christmas.
We have families.
On Christmas, and so I had lots of things I had to do yesterday. My parents are in town. And where are you, Ashley?
I'm in Canada. I'm in Sudbury. I'm back home. I'm home, like at the roots. And I visited my family last night. They said they watched, by the way. Hi.
Oh, your family watched these streams?
They do, yeah. And they said they don't understand what I'm talking about, but they said it sounds all very smart. And I was actually kind of disappointed by that, because I thought, I pride myself in being clear, I thought, anyway. And it very interesting little middle class experience for me. My parents were there, and I'm going to visit my parents, plural, in a couple hours, because my parents, who've been separated for 30 years, are weirdly back together. So bizarre. It's extremely odd. They're calling, and like both their voices are on the phone. It's so weird to say. For me, anyone who has divorced parents or parents who are separated, you know that it's you get used to saying my parent and their partner or whatever, and now it's just plural, and it's just so bizarre.
Yeah. We can talk about that in the parrot room, because I am actually fascinated. Okay. So, but also it does tie into the topic in a weird roundabout way, because this week we're going to be talking about the sexual revolution. And that we were recommended to talk about that by Cyber Dandy, who's a patron and a participant on the channel. He's our resident anarchist, young anarchist. And did you recall the message he sent to spark this? He's going to write an essay about the sexual revolution. What did he suggest that we say? Because I don't want to say anything. This seems like this is a territory where I could easily get canceled if I don't watch my steps. So what did he say that we should be talking about?
Oh, actually, I think that we should probably have Cyber Dandy on as a guest and reflect on all of our terrible mistakes that we make in this conversation, and it'll be a good struggle session. So why don't we do that?
We'll definitely do that. But I just was wondering if you recall what we were talking about the last time we were on, that then inspired him to say, "Oh, you should talk about the sexual revolution."
It was about culture. It was about everything being downstream from culture, and probably things like family politics and that kind of thing. Because the last couple of episodes we were talking about how leftism has sort of drowned itself in cultural critique.
Right. And one way, I guess, to do that is to focus on the sexual practices of your citizenry, or the war between the sexes, or those kinds of issues, rather than, I guess, on statecraft or economics or things like that.
Yeah. And I think it fits in a lot too with this idea of like a lot of people come to what I would say the so-called left, not because they want to empower the masses, but because they want to differentiate themselves and distinguish themselves from the masses. I'm different. I'm not part of them. I'm not fooled. In fact, the easiest critique that you can make is of the masses. Oh, the masses are this, the masses are that, because nobody sees themselves as part of the masses. They're like, oh, those people out there, but I'm not fooled. And so I think what happens is that people will kind of come to the left because they reject mass culture and mass society. And so there's this kind of critique of everyday people and their beliefs. And that becomes central to the left, instead of wanting to empower people, listen to people, see people as empirical, trying, living in the world, being a social being. You come to problems and try to solve them, and this is what humanity does. You see yourself as like separate from them, looking down and seeing them as kind of hapless, and you have escaped, you have freed yourself. Now that's a humongous generalization. Obviously not a lot of people, not everyone comes to the left in that way, but I see that a lot, that there's this like real sneering kind of outlook toward just like basic things that people enjoy, and but critique of the family, I think, is part of that. And I know people are going, what? The critique of the family goes back to Engels and goes back to the Communist Manifesto. I know. But I think the contemporary manifestation of it is partly influenced by a critique of mass culture and mass society.
Well, on your left says the left can't be countercultural. It's sort of a blanket statement. I think that there is a conflict or contradiction between the need for an avant-garde and the desire to be attractive to and be able to communicate with the mainstream. As someone who writes novels and makes little montage films and things like that, I want to push back and say, the left you can be on the left and be part of the counterculture. You can have a position. There can be a countercultural left. Just the entirety of the left shouldn't be countercultural. Does that seem fair to you?
Possibly. I think also being countercultural can be critiquing things that pass themselves off as countercultural, right? So I've always been a critic of anti-consumerist movements and the way that they kind of look down on people, problematize people's consumption, and fail to have a kind of a progressive outlook on consumption, and instead they kind of stop at halfway. This is a lot of critique does this. They go, oh, this thing is historically specific, therefore it's bad, instead of saying like, this thing is historically specific, it may have come out of terrible things, it may do terrible things, but it also has a potential progressive element, and we have to find that kernel within the shell, because obviously, like, having enormous factories that produce things with the touch of a button is fantastic for humanity. Within capitalism, it becomes alienated from human needs, but the ability itself is wonderful and progressive. But what happens is people stop halfway and they go, oh, this is all bad, it's all bad, and then they look back. They start looking for something else. Oh, some other way to live. They start imagining totally different ways to live, instead of understanding that our ways of living throughout all of history come out of what already exists. And something can come up and become quite progressive and quite liberatory that at one point might have been, things can become progressive and liberatory over time. It may not be very difficult to see that at the moment.
So I feel like this comment here from Kuchluk might be useful to get us onto the topic. He says, all these horn dogs here to talk about sexy stuff. Tisk tisk, sex is kind of revolutionary. Duh. Okay, maybe it is. I don't know, but it wasn't always thought to be counter-revolutionary. And again, to go back to the idea of a counterculture or a cultural critique leading the left, certainly critiques of sexual repression and the critiques of, say, homophobia is another example, have long been a part of the left. The idea of that there should be something called free love was certainly floating around even in Marx's day, and the community, the idea of communism, including the sharing of wives, has been around for a long time.
Although interestingly, I always remember the anecdote where Marx went to Paris and met like a bunch of bohemian, like for his time, the hippies, and he was like vaguely disgusted by them, or he was like, they're like all talking about free love and that sort of thing, and he was like kind of grossed out.
Well, the problem with the community of the sharing of wives was that it was still treating women as property, just communal property instead of subjects.
And this exact issue still floats around when we like all these things that you were talking about are very good, and then they kind of tip over into like, I remember somebody saying like, oh, the whole point of becoming a communist, obviously a man said this, was that you'd just be like walking around town and you would like poke a woman on the shoulder and be like, hey, do you want to fuck? And they'd be like, yeah. And it's like, that's your revolution. Mine is I'll be left alone. But that was the idea, right? It was like all these women will be mine kind of thing. And it was a very kind of one-sided idea, and the idea of sex was very much a masculine idea of sex. I'm being super regressive here. I understand that, because the idea is like, no, women love sex and they love sex just as much as men. It's just a repressive culture that keeps women from enjoying sex. Okay, possibly. We'll find out when that repressive culture goes. But I think the fact that for most women, the idea that you would have to be liberated when a man taps you on the shoulder, you should fuck him, is probably not their idea of a revolution worth fighting for.
Well, all you have to do to put that notion to bed, pardon the double entendre, is just reverse it. Would that same man find it to be revolutionary if he had to sleep with any woman or man who tapped him on the shoulder?
Yeah, exactly. It's the same thing about men who whine about women. Women want this, women want that, blah blah blah. And it's like, well, you're usually talking about like very stereotypically attractive women. And you know, if you understand that there are also other women that exist that aren't like, you know, Barbie dolls that you imagine a woman to be, you may find that they want all sorts of different things. And I don't see, and they're like, oh, women are so, this like that whole incel mindset that's like, women just want like a man that's going to treat them badly just because he's good looking and da-da-da. Well, I'm sorry, but are you tapping on the shoulder of women who look like they don't wash frequently and like, you know, who are not like Barbie dolls? No, they're talking about like stereotypically attractive women. They're mad that stereotypically attractive women will tend to date stereotypically attractive men, because the ideal that you get from like, I don't know, watching movies and that sort of thing, if you take them seriously, is that like, look, there's all sorts of attractive women and they all date ugly men. But you never really see it the other way around. You never see an ugly, an attractive man date a non-stereotypically attractive woman, do you? So they get the idea that like, no.
I love how you shifted from ugly to non.
I know. I'm trying so hard not to be an idiot.
Okay, but
that's the idea. It's like, no, it's your responsibility as a woman not to be worried about looks, but for me as a man, it's fine. They've given themselves an out like that. Do you remember that show, that awful show, Average Joe, where they like took this beauty queen and she was like, oh, looks don't matter, and they like kind of made fun of her by bringing in a bunch of like, I don't know, non-stereotypically attractive men, and like they were making fun of her, but the idea was that as a woman, you are not supposed to go for looks. You're supposed to go for other things. And as a man, of course, you go for looks. Why wouldn't you? Right?
Well, I think what I want to point out is the conversation we're having about, you know, who should be concerned about looks, how libertine we should be in a free society. You know, the notion that just you could have spontaneous sex with whoever you wanted. All of that is definitely post-sexual revolution talk. I mean, we definitely do not live in a culture which has a clear set of, norms around sex at the moment, right? Like we're confused about the issue. Oh no, did you freeze or are you just holding really still? Oh, Ashley is frozen. But oh, now I'm alone. Wow, this is how it goes for me. But well, since she's gone, I will take a look at the. Oh wait, she's back. Here she comes.
I'm so stupid. I was trying to read the comments. I
Yeah.
was trying to read the chat. But I'm on holiday. I'm visiting family, so I'm in a hotel room and I'm on my phone. And I was like, and I hit the X and I got out of the chat. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
Anyways.
But you know what I said? I said, well, oh look, Ashley's gone. Well, that's how it always goes for me. When it comes to the women, no. What I was saying was, don't you think that the way we think about and talk about these issues, whether we talk about whether or not women should or should not be swayed by looks primarily, or whether they are or aren't, whether or not we should envision a world where anyone can always get the sexual partner that they want. All of this is post-sexual revolution thinking. It's assuming that breaking free of sexual constraints is and should be the aim of a good society.
Yeah.
Which I guess what I would ask you is, do you think that sexual liberation is in and of itself a reasonable goal to be part of a revolutionary politics? Do you feel like maybe it isn't, some guy wanders down the street and just taps a woman on the shoulder whenever he wants to, but some sort of liberty, the realm of sexual freedom, is that a real realm at all? Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I tend to think that these things are downstream from material progress. So I would, my focus for any kind of revolutionary politics is on trying to find what is it that exists now that has a libertary potential in the future. What are people building that is being held back by capitalism? And whatever, we don't have to dream of entirely new societies with entirely new people. We don't have to imagine and write down blueprints for exactly what it's going to be. But we have to find some way out of the mess that we're in, which is the destructive forces of capitalism. So for me, that's always the main focus. And as I said at the beginning, human beings are empirical. When a problem comes up, we try to solve it. And I think that as we move toward some kind of liberatory future, as these things become problems, we will sort it out. We will develop new forms of family, just as we develop new forms of family within capitalism, that in some ways are good, some ways people experience as liberatory, as a haven in a heartless world, and in some ways are very bad, become areas of further exploitation, become places in which capitalism is able to prop itself up, which is what's happening now, even in like on the left of mainstream politics. I mean, the policies that are being advocated in the name of women's liberation are quite neoliberal and are in service of capitalism. But there are aspects of this that's obviously quite bad, but also that are quite good. It's good not to have for a woman to be employed, even though this is what capitalism needs. And the real driver for women's employment is trying to boost economic growth through boosting employment rates and pushing women into insecure work that they wouldn't otherwise want to do, by making it very difficult not to do that, not to work. Even though that's quite a bad thing, it's also quite a good thing, because obviously in the past, women were very dependent on their partners. And through work, through being involved in the working world, you had that a certain amount of liberation. So there's always like sort of two sides to this. So I can imagine that as we move forward, and we try to find some sort of liberatory material politics, the question of how we will organize ourselves and our sort of sexual relations with each other will probably become more powerful, But what we develop will be something that fits with a new economic paradigm, which does not yet exist. So for me, these kinds of questions, I think, are, I don't know, I'm fully open to being completely wrong about this, as I probably am. But for me, it seems like something like a blueprint, like, oh, how are we going to relate to each other, and how are we going to organize our sexuals? And for me, it's just, I don't know. We're not there yet. How are we doing it now can give us an indication of something big that's changing in society as well, where a lot of people are not forming, not, still living in families is the major way in which most people around the world, some kind of family, must be clear about that, some kind of family, not like
a traditional one like yours where your parents are together. So so the question of well, just to go back to the realm of sexual freedom in the present, I mean, when you say, as you did, that we will be able to work out these sorts of relationships after the revolution, or after we've gotten a hold of the material basis.
No, it's not. That's why I started to say I'm probably wrong about this, because it's not that we are like saving these questions for the future. We are working it out now. That's what I was trying to say. Like when I was sort of saying, like, there's no point in saying like, oh, should the purpose of revolution be sexual freedom or whatever? I think that's blueprint. But we are working out our relations with each other in new contexts now. And that's what I was starting to say with, we are developing new ways of forming families, and these families may not be blood ties to people. A lot of people will talk about, their family are these sorts of people that they have formed over time. Or you have the people that you have your children with, the person that you have your children with, and then you have the person that you raise your children with, and then you have the person that you grow old with. This is another way that people organize their families. And we are working out gender roles as well. And at the moment where the economic basis of those gender roles is older gender roles is starting to deteriorate. So we're developing new ways of performing gendered roles, or developing new ones, or rejecting them. So we are developing these things now in the culture. We are working through contradictions, and this in the sort of, it's a terrible simplification, but in the superstructure, we are responding to a certain amount of change in the superstructure by empirically working it out for ourselves. This is what we're doing. And so out of these changes, out of the difficulty that families have in supporting themselves, the difficulty of any kind of older form of family in existing, and the unworkability of that for a lot of people, undesirability of that for a lot of people in new contexts, means that we are changing those things. But not everybody is. And it's not that it doesn't work for everybody. For a lot of people, the family is experienced as a positive thing, as a desire, as a goal. And this is the kind of the contradictions that we're sort of working out now in our culture. And I think sort of like having this whole conversation as though it's only cultural means that you can kind of then bifurcate things into like, oh, the bad old world where the bad old things happened, and we should get rid of that. And this is a new good thing, and everybody should jump on board with that, when in fact it's sort of people working out what works for them. And I think you have too much of a sort of blueprint idea of how people should live, then you risk kind of imposing that on other people, and then it's perceived as an attack. It's felt like, oh, you are attacking me and my attempt to kind of pursue my own desires and the things that I want within this world.
Well, it occurs to me that when people talk about sexual freedom, for the most part, they're talking about how they think the world should be. They're talking about, what do we want after the revolution, even if they're not envisioning the world changing through revolution. How do we think the world ought to operate? And another way to address it, if you're a revolutionary Marxist, say, is what kinds of sexual relationships would be best for developing a revolutionary politics, a working class politics?
No.
Right. That's not.
No, what? No, I don't want to dictate people's sexual relationships for the benefit of revolution. What? No,
What
that's the
kinds
thing.
of
It's like
what
that's
kinds of
just the whole prefigurative thing, right? It's like, oh, if we
no,
don't
it's not
live it out in our
prefigurative.
lives,
It's not prefigurative. It's explicitly not prefigurative because it's not
okay.
saying how do we create the kinds of life we want now. No, it's how do we create the kind of relationships between working class people that will help to develop a
This is
party.
the totally wrong question to ask because you were going to look at somebody, the masses of humanity, and you're sitting there rubbing your chin going, how do I want to organize you? How do I want to fix you and make you live in the way that I no, that's the problem, right? It's like, oh, you're doing something wrong here, and that's why we haven't got revolution. If I could just fix the way you fuck people, then so all the pieces are gonna fall into place. If I could just make sure that you don't want to get married. You don't want that because that's bad for the revolution. And so,
Yeah,
well,
but
I
I
want to
think
get
you're
married.
look, okay. I feel like I'm actually excited here because I think you and I disagree. Um,
It's because you're
um,
divorced and you're bitter. No, I'm sorry.
oh
That,
my God.
that was evil. Oh, Jesus Christ.
Well, no, but I mean, like you could say that in every conversation that we have, and it would be true. But in this case, about
I
anything,
was
about
just
ice
kidding. I'm
cream.
sorry.
No, it's fair enough. No, okay. Right, but you're okay. You're pointing in the direction I'm going though, because I'm gonna start sounding traditional, right? Because I'm gonna say, okay, we should ask whether or not having, uh, and again, this might be I'm divorced and bitter, but we should have families that are intact if we want people to be able to have the security they need to organize politically. We should de-emphasize hookup culture if we want to develop a revolutionary politics. We should emphasize longer lasting relationships and deeper connections if we want to have the kind of population that can be disciplined and make commitments. Sure, yeah, this is the divorced guy who got left talking, but keep taking that into account. Do you think those ideas are something that I'm just trying to impose upon the world? And
Yes.
is that authoritarian? And
Yes.
if it is, do you think the relationships we have in society now are not being imposed? That there are no forces
Mm.
that are acting upon people now? That everyone is actually already free, and this is just what they want to do? Or do
No,
we
look.
have to try to exert power over society, and that means over other people, if we're going to organize it differently than the forces are
So here's the
already
thing, though.
organized?
There's like two logics that you've got going on here. One is I
Mhm,
don't have a pen and paper, and I usually write this stuff down. So
mhm.
you remember my two logics, so I can
Okay.
go back to them. So
Yeah.
one is social pathology, and the second one, if I've already forgotten, the, the second one is that there is no, I've forgotten it now. So I'll go with the first one. So it's social pathology. So it's this idea that there's a healthy social body, or there's some kind of healthy thing, and the problem is the people are a pathology and need to fix them in some way. And it's like, if we could just fix people, then this thing that I want, this functioning organism, even if it doesn't exist now, I suppose, is the even though like social pathology is typically conservative, it's about what exists now. But you can see this like kernel of the same kind of logic, which is that something is wrong with people, and it's the people that are the problem, and there's something about their relationships. Oh yes, the other second logic was the pre-social self. So there's some social pathology says that there's something wrong with the people. If we could just fix them, then there would be harmony. And you got to go in, you got to change people's relationships, change the way they relate to each other, change their values, change their belief systems, change them, instead of seeing those things as coming out of society, which is what you said. So then you're like, okay, is it that people are already free, or is society not exerting an influence on them? So obviously society is already exerting an influence on people, but there's nothing before that. It's not like there's like this perfect pre-social kind of freedom that people would enact if only society didn't come in and thwart them. No,
Mhm.
you like, men make their own history, but they don't make it in conditions that they choose. They don't cut it from the whole cloth.
Mhm.
They have, you get what you have. You make your life out of the conditions that are available to you. And there are certain things that policy does, for example, that does exert an influence on what people do with their lives. Like, you can have pro-marriage policies that to a certain extent encourage people to get married. You can have pro-natal policies, which interestingly are not all that effective in a lot of places. So Hungary, for example, has a pro-natalist policy where they do a ton of stuff to try to encourage people to have kids. And it has had, it's had an effect, but not a massive effect. So there's only so much that you can kind of do to kind of, with policy, to come in and like really fundamentally change people's relationships with each other without paying any attention to what people are working with, which is the base of society, and trying to reproduce themselves in some way that makes sense for them and is feasible. So it's not like people would have all this freedom, and there's like this perfect kind of totally free way outside of any kind of coercion that they would form relationships. Society is always going to exist, and it's always human beings are social animals. You put people in a closet, they don't just like walk out being like, singing the praises of like Robinson Crusoe on his island and give me a pen and paper. Like, no, they don't even, you don't even bring food to your face. You bring your face to food. Like, there's so much that is social. So there's no ideal pre-social self. There's no ideal pre-social family form. There will always be society that exerts an influence on people. And that's not a loss of freedom. It's only within society do we become individuals. And through this enormous, outside of the context of the discussion of family, only through this enormous socialization and production that we have now, are we able to become individuals in a way that we wouldn't have been 1,000 years ago. So this is a contradiction, that so much is socialized in society. There's so much connection between human beings now that you don't even realize it or know about it. Like, you don't know who made the chair you're sitting on, right? But the fact that you don't have to make it yourself allows you to do this with me. Like, this allows you to become an individual. The extraordinary socialization allows you to become an individual.
Actually, I agree with everything you're saying. I just don't see how any of it relates to what my question was. I mean, because let me give you an example. If I was, we're part of a revolutionary union. So we're in the working class movement. We have membership, which is struggling for socialism and for their own working conditions to improve. And we were leaders in the union, and we knew that there was a family that was having troubles because the man was running around on his wife, and that it was possibility that marriage would break apart. And not only that the children in that family would be split up, and that their economic situation would become precarious, and that would bring that worker possibly out of the job, break him off from the union. So would it be in our interest to discourage his need for sexual liberation, tell him to get his act together, go back to his wife and kids, and join the struggle for revolution? That's the question. It's not, should we, try to impose certain mores broadly on society,
right,
because culture comes first, or should we try to liberate people back into their natural state? But if we're part of a revolutionary struggle, what kinds of commitments around sex and reproduction would be most beneficial to that revolutionary struggle? Now, that's obviously going to be like in the struggle for the Kurds, the liberation of women and the education of women, and giving women leadership roles and bringing them into the military and breaking them free from their traditional roles has been vitally important, so that they can have more fighters, in the struggle. So I think these things probably change depending on the context. But the question I have for people like you and me who are, urban in the developed world, trying to develop a socialist movement is, does the idea of sexual liberation as it's expressed now help or hinder our movement?
Yeah, again, like the very specific situation that you mentioned is a very specific situation. So I think that I guess what I'm railing against is this idea that there should be, it's always like there ought to be a rule. There ought to be this one thing, we should all abide by it. And this is when it becomes an issue, because it's like, well, it depends on the situation. Like when it becomes a problem, then you start to say, look, this particular thing is getting in the way. In the same way as like look, this particular like conjugal family is no longer conducive to the running of society, people begin to create all kinds of policy, or they kind of tail a trend in which people move out of those families anyway because it's no longer working for society. So my point is that it's not like you can give somebody advice and that's useful, and we can say this probably is not a good idea, and make an argument that you person as a thinking being might also agree that this is probably not a good idea for you to do, without saying like, I from on high impose a rule that all families must be this, or that it's in that situation, it's I guess I'm saying it's more along the lines of you can give advice to people and that's helpful because we're all human beings and that's what we do with each other. And I'm sort of against this idea of like there should be a rule and there's just one way to do it and everything else is bad. And this is kind of where I think we tend to go. We are always like, we're very uncomfortable with this lack of certainty sometimes. And we want to make rules to get rid of lack of certainty and a lack of control over people and the fact that people can be quite unpredictable. We like predictability as human beings. We like a predictable society. And so what more predictable way can you do things but to make rules? We even make rules about like social change. We even want to like, like make a rule about, cat calling women and that sort of thing, where it's like, no, we don't, as a society, we're going to say no to this. It's a very bad idea. Make a rule. Instead of recognizing like, yeah, a lot of people really don't like that. And some people do. Some people do like that. But you can make a rule and you say, no, I demand that you conform to this, my idea of progress. This is what I'm running against. Because it's out of a distrust that people can do it for themselves in their informal networks, like sort of getting advice from friends and figuring out for themselves, I fucked up my life and I shouldn't have done this. It's like, no, people don't do that unless it's imposed from on high, unless there's a rule.
Right. Okay. So there was a
I'm afraid to click on the chat now because I'm afraid I'm gonna exit myself from the conversation.
Someone asked, how much does working for society mean working for capitalism?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to change that question and say, how much does trusting the informal networks in our society to work things out for themselves mean allowing capitalist institutions and the state to continue to dominate?
Okay, how much does changing those things mean allowing capitalist institutions in the state to dominate?
Well,
because currently that's what capitalist institutions in the state are trying to do. They don't have a laissez-faire approach to the family. Since the 1990s, there has been a strong desire to dictate everything that families do. They don't care about the structure of families. You could form a family out of whatever you want, as long as you talk to the baby in the womb, you intervene in the first 3 years, you make sure that you don't do this and don't do that and do this and don't, and follow a gazillion different rules for child rearing. There's an enormous amount of intervention into families and the structure of family, not the structure of families, what goes on in families and dictating what parents do, to the point where parenting has become extremely intensive and very, very difficult. And people think like, oh, the problem is that you're working and that's why you don't have time. No, the problem is that, yes, you are working, you're expected to be an intensive worker, but also the incredible amount of intervention from the state and so on, and from experts that don't trust that you're going to do it because you're going to fuck your kids up. That's what makes the other side of that equation so difficult. And it's experienced as a time crunch, but you have two roles that you're expected to do 100%. And they're like, oh, well, let the father do it. So, father too can be subject to these enormous intervention. So it's not like, oh, well, just let things go. It's no, the state's not letting things go too. So trying to invoke cultural change is also led by the state and by all these institutions. They also think that cultural change is a key to everything, to solving social problems. They think the problems come from working class people and their cultures.
Okay, so you're saying when do these interventions occur, and and what are the penalties for not following the guidelines?
At worst, you can have your kids taken away for corporal punishment in the home. So if you decide that the best way to raise your children is, and I'm not talking about beating your kids. Everybody agrees that is wrong. It is already illegal. It has been illegal for a very long time. But a lot of policies, a lot of countries have recognized that parents may choose to use light forms of corporal punishment. Beating a child, leaving bruises, this sort of thing, that's obviously illegal. But many parents will choose to give their children a light smack on the back of the legs or the hand. Now, this is now illegal in a lot of countries, and there's a worldwide movement. Very small number of people who've had an enormous effect on policy around the world. They have teamed up with international organizations to go into poorer countries to rewrite their children's policy, their family policy, as part of structural adjustment reforms. So they had an enormous effect on policy. A very small number of people. These are not mass movements for change, and so they've made that illegal. So you can have your children taken away because there's this idea that any kind of pain inflicted is necessarily damaging. And this is now moving over to, there's a discussion in France recently about the naughty step. The naughty step is a form of child maltreatment, this sort of thing. So there's just an increasing attempt to sort of go in. And I know a lot of our viewers, I don't know what it is. It's like parents are the easiest thing to hate on. It's like, the parents, where are the parents? The parents are lazy. The parents are they've like totally imbibed this neoliberal ethos where all problems start in the home and start in early life. So I know that this is falling on deaf ears, but it's like, that is one of the examples of that. There's this movement of like positive parenting taken to its extreme where you don't say no, and any negative experience is seen as de facto as necessarily damaging to the child. And so in that situation, you can have your children taken away. And there's a case, and I warned about this, there's a case now in the UK where, of course, a Nigerian family, immigrant family, has been separated. Father's lost his job, has not seen his children for 3 months because of an allegation. And this is the thing, when you have an allegation, if you have been accused of assaulting your child, and there's no distinction anymore between corporal punishment in Scotland, for example, they've removed that distinction. There's no distinction now between corporal punishment and beating a child. So now you've been accused of assaulting your child. They take the father out of the home. They separate the children from the parents. So there are like extreme consequences for this. And I've said this many times, like the reason why this gets under my skin and really pisses me off is because there's a long legacy of the state blaming parents for problems, and in particular, working class, poor, colonized families. These were the ones that were problematized. So it makes me so mad because this is what they said about indigenous families. The indigenous mother cannot raise the good liberal citizens. The indigenous, and before that, Christian and all that. This is the logic that made them take the children away and put them in residential schools. That you could not, the problems that existed in communities were because of the mothers, because of the parents, that they were not raising good children, so separate them. And that's what they did. And they caused even worse damage. And now the major logic is, because of that, that history and all the bad things that we did, now really you can't raise your kids. And that's why we're taking them away. And they're just constantly separating parents and children. And this kind of like, the horror that this caused people to have their children taken away from them. And like there's stories in my family about this as well. The kids, anyway, it makes me so upset I'm gonna cry.
Well, let me just intervene because
what I was gonna say is the horror of this, and I see people going in this direction of like, it all starts in the home, This is the legacy of social pathology, that everything would be fine. We would get our objectives. We could just change people, fix them, make them raise their kids properly. And the state wants their hands in this. And they've wanted to do something, wanted to be able to intervene, to change the way people raise their kids for ages. This is what the liberal state has wanted to do since it could not explain why we don't have the things it promises. Well, it can't be us. We've declared liberty, equality, fraternity. There must be something wrong with you, something wrong with it's a racial thing. It's a cultural thing. There's always something wrong with people. That is the logic that often guides this sort of thing, and why it really bothers me. And so they will come down hard on families. And there is a very real consequence of separating families. And I'm not saying that there's never any need to separate families. There often is, obviously.
Listen,
but the bar is getting lower and lower and lower.
But actually, I think that what what happens is that people choose the kinds of state or community interventions, institutional interventions that they like and support, and they also choose the ones that they dislike and want to oppose. And when they oppose an intervention, they say you can trust people to handle things themselves. And when they are for it, they say, you know, something like, well, people need uh, institutions and power structures around them just to be able to be supported. So I'll give you an example of what I mean. Do you think that the state should have any role at all in when it comes to marriages? Should the state be in the position of recognizing marriages or recognizing what a family is, providing support for families?
Well,
Uh,
they have to now, because they have to deal with private property and all of that stuff and visiting rights. So they have to, and this is where there's like property and passing things on, and who has the power to make decisions. And this is where the campaigns to expand definitions of the family on the part of the state are obviously progressive. Why? Where are you going with that? I feel really
I'm going
lost without my notes. I'm realizing, like, how many
where I'm
notes do I
going.
usually write when we talk? And someone
Where I'm
wrote, I'm
going
sure
is that
Chat GPT can give more coherent answers.
I
I
can
apologize.
someone accused me of being on Team Jordan Peterson earlier in the chat, and so for the sake of playing devil's advocate, I'll pretend that I am, right. And I can't do Kermit the Frog the way he does, but let's say, like, I agree with you. Parents are being undermined by the neo-Marxists in society, and we have to stand up to them and help them get their freedom. But at the same time, we need enforced monogamy in this society, because or you know, and I don't mean the state, maybe it's cultural, I don't know, but we need to create more traditional family structures, because after all, evolution and biology and myth and
No.
Jung has shown that you know, this is a deeply practical structure that's developed over billions of years in the human
It hasn't.
species, and so on and so forth. But the point is actually not whether you agree with enforced monogamy or not, but at what point do we think we need to intervene and try to set up guidelines and create forms of discipline, whether it's within a party, a political party that we might be forming, a movement from the state? When do we want to start asking things of people?
When it becomes a problem.
Well, so that brings me back to my point about, do we think that the kind of sexual revolution and sexual movements for sexual liberation have become a problem for working class people who might want to organize for socialism?
I don't know, Doug, what do you think?
I don't want to say, because I will get canceled.
I'm already canceling myself here. I've been like fully forgiven all my prejudices. Go on.
Okay. All right. No, I think that there is I definitely don't think that families or I don't think everyone needs to be in a long-term relationship. I don't think that families are for everybody. I don't think that non-traditional families are a problem, but I do think that we are encouraged to treat our relationships, especially around sex, way too lightly, and that that it's a product of atomization more than it is a part of some sort of project for liberation, and that we are kind of stuck in a contradiction between wanting to free civil society, free everyday people, give people democratic control over their life, and create the kinds of structures that people need in order to organize together effectively to change society. That it's not easy to determine, you know, how to intervene, but I do think that by and large, most working people should be encouraged to try to stick it out together. And I say that as a bitter divorced man. So yeah, that's the end of my rant. But the point that I would make is it's sometimes easy to think, oh, anytime anyone wants to try to impose a cultural guideline or ask a question about how we should change behavior now, to think that they are trying to stand above working class people, use state power to, as if there isn't a need for a greater change. But I think discipline is going to be necessary if we're going to organize for material change.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, and again, like I have like faith in people that this is why the like cultural pendulum tends to swing back and forth, because it's like people kind of want to liberate themselves from forms of family that once useful have started to turn around and become forms of control and prisons for us. And so they go to the other extreme, like we should just have free love and so on. And then some people begin to think like, there's a certain amount of emptiness I'm feeling here, that I'm kind of like using people like they're objects, and I don't really want to do that. And that there's a certain amount of self-sacrifice that at the end of the day, while it hurts, is a good thing. And I think there's a tendency to go to extremes where it's like any kind of self-sacrifice is bad, like, and that's a violence done to people. And I think people kind of realize that no, there's a certain amount of not getting what you want that is good for you.
I'm looking at the chat. I'm sorry.
I know. I'm just like, this is the worst. I'm sorry. I feel like I'm just like totally rambling.
No, you're doing fine. You're doing. But look, someone says divorce dads will be the vanguard of the revolution. Our true pronouns bitter divorce. And then someone says commodifying interpersonal and even sexual relationships is totally liberating, Doug. What do you mean? Are you a reactionary? Canceled. So,
well, that's exactly it, right? Where it's like people started to go in this direction where everything is being so commodified, and we're learning, all the time that it's self-reliance in any kind of, and by self-reliance, I mean like within your own informal networks, and any kind of informality is dangerous and risky, and you should go to a professional. This is what I see with my students at university all the time. They're always told constantly, like, this problem cannot be dealt with on your own. Are you mad? That's dangerous. Always go to professional. Always go to professional. So then something happens in their lives. They go to the professional. The professional's shocked. They're like, what are you doing here? Like, your dog died. This is normal. And they're like, well, you told me that I was supposed to come here. And so people become so disempowered that they think naturally, as a progressive thing, things should be professionalized, and we should like break down barriers and so on to that. And so then this winds up in people's interpersonal relationships where somebody comes to them with a problem and they're like, I don't want to do the emotional labor to deal with that, as though it should be a form of emotional labor and commodified. That this part of this relationship where I have to sacrifice talking about myself for 15 minutes is a danger and a violence. That goes to a professional, right? And you can see that I could well imagine this logic. Like, I'm not giving sex away for free. I've got, I'm obviously gonna go and give it on OnlyFans because it obviously should be commodified.
I'm gonna clip that out. It's gonna be put up on TikTok.
Obviously, I'm joking, but yeah. You can see this kind of like logic where it's like everything becomes commodified, everything's professionalized, and it's like, why would I give my friendship away for free? Like, why would I give advice away for free? Everything, people will actually, I see this online where it's like, I'm not going to educate you, put some money in my tip cup and maybe I'll tell you, and it's right. This is what's happening, and it's put across as progressive.
And this is, I think, a good moment to remind people that if they want to watch the second half of this conversation, they could go to patreon.com and we will be glad to be. Someone says we're being vague. In the parrot room, we are very specific. We're much more prepared. The real education happens there on Patreon. Actually, two other people altogether who are much more put together than we are come in and talk. Look,
I find it really hard to be specific because one thing that I'm really shocked by is how little people know about the trajectory of parenting policy in many countries, and so I feel like I have to explain like 30 years.
No, you were being very specific about that.
Okay,
you don't have to worry about that. But someone says, I wonder what the sexual revolution means to LGBT people, and I would say that as a demisexual, and therefore part of the LGBTQRS plus community. I can speak to that in the parrot room. So no, obviously the sexual revolution was very important to the struggle for gay rights, and but it also ended kind of strangely, because sexual revolution, gay rights did not start out as meaning we want to have a traditional family. I mean, that was maybe gay marriage was always part of the struggle, but now I think many of the same questions, not just like in contradictions, are in the gay community as are in the straight one. I at least that's what it seems to me, as a demisexual, sapiosexual whose identity needs to be respected.
No, but that's a really important point, actually, that the movement has been toward forming traditional families, monogamous units in which children are raised. That has been like the movement for liberation, which, some people have fought against. I know I've got some gay friends who are really against gay marriage because they were like, no, the whole point of sexual liberation was that you didn't do that. You were rebelling against the necessity of a monogamous relationship in which children are reared, and that there were other ways of forming relationships. And I was like, okay, maybe, but if people don't want that and they want to get married, then they should. That was just my very simple response to that. But it's just interesting that was the direction that it took, and states were happy, more or less. Many states were happy to jump on board with it, and states that were kind of having problems with declining birth rates a lot of states that were having these issues tended to be more or less against it. But yeah, as I said before, like the neoliberal state doesn't care the form that your family takes, like it's actual, people forming it. They care more about what happens in the family.
Right. Well, listen, we're at 56 minutes. Do you think we should stick around for the last 3 minutes, or should
Well, I'm gonna spill the tea about my traditional family unit that has reformed itself recently, and also we will let it all hang out in the parrot room, because I feel like I've been really vague because I know that people feel extremely strongly about this kind of stuff. And I've gone and just wound up saying just some stupidity. So I'm going to try to be a little bit more specific in an area where I feel
I was so constrained. My tongue was tied, and I felt pressured to be, politically correct in this stream.
We have to go to our safe space, Doug, and and also we wanted to play a clip from a pickup artist. So stay tuned for that.
I have a clip from in the next week. We're gonna have episode of Fatal Dates come out. Susanna Kleeman dates a dating coach or pickup artist named Eric Disco. His last name is Disco, apparently. And we have a clip we have a montage that I put together and a tiny clip from that interview. We'll show it in the parrot room. Thanks everybody for stopping by. Next week we'll be back on Monday. We're here on Tuesday because of Boxing Day, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the parrot room.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases